The ancient stone was cold beneath Charlotte's trembling fingers as she traced the weathered name carved into the warrior's tomb. Thunder rolled across the Scottish Highlands, matching the storm brewing in her heart. She had travelled 300 miles in the dead of night, driven by a secret that could destroy the monarchy itself. The weight of the crown jewels hidden in her leather satchel seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "I swear by your honour, brave William," she whispered to the tomb, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "The crown will be safe, even if it costs me everything." Lightning illuminated her face, revealing tears mixing with raindrops. At 26, Charlotte MacLeod had already lived through enough betrayal to last several lifetimes. Born into nobility but raised in exile, she had spent years planning this moment. The oath she was about to make would bind her to a path of danger, deception, and possible death. But what drove this young woman to risk everything for a crown that had never belonged to her family? What secret did she carry that was worth more than her own life? And why did she choose this remote tomb of a forgotten medieval warrior to make her solemn vow? The answers lay buried in years of conspiracy, hidden in the shadows of royal courts, and written in blood across the pages of Scottish history. This is the true story of Charlotte MacLeod, and the secret oath that would change the fate of her kingdom forever. Charlotte MacLeod pressed her face against the carriage window as the familiar landscape of the Scottish Highlands rolled past. After 12 years in French exile, everything looked smaller than she remembered, yet somehow more precious. The heather-covered hills stretched endlessly under a grey October sky, and ancient castles dotted the horizon like sleeping giants from her childhood dreams. Her fingers traced the outline of the sealed letter hidden in her coat pocket. The parchment crackled softly, reminding her why she had returned to this homeland that had cast her family out when she was only 14. The letter bore the royal seal, but its contents were far from royal. Instead, it contained details of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the British Crown. The carriage hit a particularly rough patch of road, jolting Charlotte from her thoughts. Her travelling companion, an elderly Frenchwoman named Madame Dubois, stirred in her sleep. Charlotte had paid the woman handsomely to accompany her on the journey, knowing that a young woman travelling alone would attract unwanted attention. What Madame Dubois did not know was that Charlotte's luggage contained more than just clothing and personal belongings. Hidden beneath layers of silk gowns and French perfumes lay a collection of documents that could topple governments, letters written in the hand of princes, financial records showing payments to foreign agents, and, most damning of all, a detailed plan to replace the current monarch with a puppet ruler controlled by enemy powers. Charlotte had spent 3 years gathering this evidence while working as a translator in the French court, using her linguistic skills and noble connections to uncover the conspiracy piece by piece. The carriage began its descent into the valley, where Clan MacLeod had once held sway. Charlotte's heart clenched as she saw the ruins of her family's castle in the distance. Castle Dunvegan had been her world until that terrible night when soldiers had come in the darkness. Her father, accused of treason, had been given a choice, execution or exile. The family had chosen exile, leaving behind everything they had ever known. But Charlotte's father had not lived long in foreign lands. The shame and heartbreak had consumed him within 2 years, leaving Charlotte and her younger brother Hamish orphans in a strange country. Hamish had joined the French army and died fighting in foreign wars, while Charlotte had learned to survive by using her wit and education. She had become fluent in 4 languages, skilled in diplomacy, and expert at moving unseen through the corridors of power. Now, at 26, she was returning with purpose. The conspiracy she had uncovered threatened not just the current monarch, but the very independence of Scotland itself. The plotters planned to use a manufactured crisis to justify foreign intervention, ultimately leading to Scotland being absorbed entirely into a larger continental empire. Charlotte could not allow her homeland to disappear, even if that homeland had rejected her family. As evening approached, the carriage finally stopped at a small inn in the village of Glenmore. Charlotte helped the sleeping Madame Dubois down from the carriage and secured rooms for the night. The innkeeper, a weathered man with kind eyes, recognized something familiar in Charlotte's bearing, despite her French clothing and accent. "You have the look of the Highlands about you, miss," he said as he handed her the room key. "Been away long?" "Longer than I hoped, shorter than I feared," Charlotte replied carefully. She had practiced hiding her Scottish accent during her years abroad, but in this place, surrounded by the speech of her childhood, it threatened to return. That night, alone in her small room, Charlotte spread the documents across her bed and reviewed her plans once more. She had already sent word ahead through trusted channels, requesting a meeting with certain individuals who had remained loyal to her family despite their disgrace. These people formed a small but dedicated network of Scots who put their country above politics and personal gain. The most important of these allies was Duncan Fraser, a man who had served as her father's steward and had refused to abandon the MacLeod cause even after the exile. Duncan had spent the past 12 years quietly building connections, gathering information, and waiting for an opportunity to restore his family's honour while protecting Scotland's interests. Tomorrow, Charlotte would meet with Duncan at a location known only to them, the tomb of Sir William MacLeod, a medieval warrior who had died defending Scottish independence centuries earlier. The tomb lay in a remote glen, far from curious eyes and listening ears. It was there that Charlotte planned to reveal the full extent of the conspiracy and seek Duncan's help in preventing the catastrophe that threatened their homeland. As she prepared for sleep, Charlotte opened a small locket that hung around her neck. Inside was a miniature portrait of her father, painted just before their exile. His eyes seemed to look at her across the years, and she could almost hear his voice reminding her of the MacLeod family motto, "Hold fast." No matter what happened in the coming days, she would hold fast to her duty, her honour, and her love for Scotland. The wind howled outside her window, carrying with it the scent of heather and the promise of rain. Charlotte fell asleep to the sound of her homeland welcoming her back, unaware that enemy agents had already begun tracking her movements. The conspiracy she sought to expose had tentacles that reached far beyond the royal courts, and her return had not gone unnoticed. In London, a coded message was being prepared for urgent delivery to Edinburgh. The message was simple but ominous. The MacLeod daughter has returned. Take necessary measures. Charlotte's mission of salvation was about to become a race against time, with the fate of Scotland hanging in the balance. The next morning dawned grey and misty, typical weather for the Scottish Highlands in late October. Charlotte woke before sunrise, her mind immediately focused on the day ahead. She dressed simply but elegantly, choosing clothing that would allow her to move freely across rough terrain while still maintaining the appearance of a respectable lady. Madame Dubois was still sleeping soundly when Charlotte slipped out of the inn. She had arranged to rent a horse from the stable behind the building, telling the stable boy that she wished to visit some old family sites. The boy, no more than 16, looked at her with curiosity but asked no questions, when she paid him generously for his discretion. The ride to the warrior's tomb would take most of the morning. Charlotte had memorized the route from maps her father had drawn for her years ago, during one of his melancholy moments when he would speak of their lost homeland. The tomb was located in Glenmore, a hidden valley that could only be reached by following an ancient cattle path through the mountains. As Charlotte rode through the misty morning, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 12 years ago, she had been a carefree girl, more interested in books than politics. Now she was a woman carrying secrets that could reshape the map of Europe. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders, but she had learned to bear it with grace and determination. The path began to climb steeply as she entered the mountains. Her horse, a sturdy Highland pony, picked its way carefully over the rocky ground. The mist began to clear as the sun rose higher, revealing spectacular views of the surrounding countryside. Charlotte paused several times to rest her mount and to check that she was not being followed. Each time, the landscape behind her appeared empty and peaceful. But appearances could be deceiving. 3 miles back, hidden among a stand of pine trees, 2 men on horseback watched her progress through telescopes. They had been tracking her since she left the inn, maintaining a careful distance to avoid detection. These men were not Scottish patriots or French agents, but representatives of a third party whose interests lay in maintaining the status quo at any cost. The leader of the 2 men, a cold-eyed individual named Morrison, lowered his telescope and turned to his companion. "She's heading for Glenmore, just as our sources predicted. Send word to Edinburgh that the package is moving toward the designated location. We'll maintain surveillance and await further orders." Charlotte, unaware of the danger following her, continued her journey towards the appointment that would change everything. The warrior's tomb awaited, as it had for centuries, ready to witness another chapter in the long struggle for Scottish freedom. The oath she would swear there would bind her to a path of danger and sacrifice, but also to the possibility of redemption for her family and salvation for her homeland. As she crested the final hill before descending into Glenmore, Charlotte saw the ancient stone tomb in the distance. Her heart began to beat faster, not with fear, but with anticipation. The moment she had been preparing for during 12 long years of exile was finally at hand. The crown would be safe, whatever the cost to herself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through Scottish history for generations to come. The ancient tomb of Sir William MacLeod stood like a silent sentinel in the heart of Glenmore, weathered by centuries of Highland storms but still proud and defiant. Charlotte dismounted from her horse and approached the monument slowly, her footsteps echoing softly on the moss-covered stones that surrounded it. The tomb was larger than she had imagined, carved from local granite and decorated with Celtic knots that seemed to dance in the shifting light. She was early for her meeting with Duncan Fraser, but Charlotte preferred it that way. The solitude gave her time to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. She placed her hand on the carved name of her ancestor, feeling the rough stone beneath her palm. Sir William had died defending this glen against English invaders in 1314, and his sacrifice had become legend among the Highland clans. "Give me strength," she whispered to the stone warrior. "Help me protect what you died for." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Charlotte turn toward the entrance of the glen. A single rider was making his way carefully down the steep path, and Charlotte recognized the purposeful way he sat his horse. Duncan Fraser had not changed much in 12 years. His red hair was now streaked with grey, and new lines marked his weathered face, but his posture remained straight and his eyes alert. Duncan dismounted and walked toward Charlotte with measured steps. When he reached her, he removed his cap and bowed deeply, just as he had when she was a girl in her father's castle. "Miss Charlotte," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." Charlotte felt tears threaten to overwhelm her composure, but she forced herself to remain strong. There would be time for sentiment later. Now, duty called. "Duncan, faithful Duncan," she replied, clasping his hands in hers. "Thank you for coming. I know the risks you take by meeting with me." "No risk is too great for the MacLeod name," Duncan replied firmly. "Your father was the best man I ever served, and his daughter carries his honor. But tell me, lass, why have you returned after all these years?" Your letter spoke of urgent matters but gave few details. Charlotte looked around the empty glen once more, ensuring they were truly alone. Then she reached into her saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio bound with silk ribbons. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained the concentrated essence of danger itself. "Duncan, what I am about to show you will shock you beyond measure," she began, carefully. "During my time in France, I was approached by certain individuals who believed I might be useful to their cause. They thought that my family's disgrace would make me eager for revenge against the crown. They were wrong, but I let them believe otherwise." She untied the ribbons and opened the portfolio, revealing the documents she had spent years collecting. Duncan's eyes widened as he saw the royal seals, the official letterheads, and the unmistakably genuine appearance of the papers. "For 3 years, I pretended to be a bitter exile willing to sell information about Scottish defences and loyalist networks," Charlotte continued. "In reality, I was documenting their conspiracy. What you see here is evidence of a plot that reaches the highest levels of several European courts." Duncan took the first document with trembling hands. It was a letter written in the hand of Prince Eduardo of Castile, discussing payments to Scottish nobles in exchange for their cooperation in a planned invasion. The amounts mentioned were staggering, representing enough gold to buy the loyalty of half the Highland clans. "Sweet Mary," Duncan breathed, his face growing pale. "This cannot be true." "Lord Mackenzie, the Earl of Ross, Baron Campbell, these are men who have sworn loyalty to the crown."
"Keep reading," Charlotte said grimly. "It gets worse."
The next document was a detailed map of Scottish coastal defences, annotated in what appeared to be the hand of Sir James Stuart, the King's own military advisor.
Alongside it was a letter from a French general, thanking Stuart for the information and promising him a position in the new government that would be established after the invasion. But the most damning evidence was contained in a sealed envelope that Charlotte had managed to intercept just before leaving France. Inside was a complete timeline for the conspiracy, beginning with manufactured incidents designed to create unrest among the Scottish people. These would be followed by requests for foreign assistance to restore order, ultimately leading to the installation of a puppet ruler controlled by continental powers. The final phase of the plan involved the physical removal of the current monarch and the crown jewels of Scotland. The jewels would be taken to France and used to legitimize the new regime, while the deposed ruler would disappear permanently into foreign captivity. They planned to strike during the Highland Games next month, Charlotte explained as Duncan read through the timeline with growing horror. When thousands of people gather in Edinburgh, they will stage a series of attacks blamed on Scottish nationalists. In the chaos that follows, their allies within the government will request foreign intervention. Duncan set down the documents with shaking hands and looked at Charlotte with a mixture of admiration and fear. "Lass, do you understand what you've done? You've uncovered a conspiracy that involves some of the most powerful people in Scotland. They will not hesitate to kill you to protect their secrets." I know, Charlotte replied quietly. That's why I need your help. We must find a way to expose this plot without giving them time to execute it early or eliminate the evidence. But more than that, we must protect the crown jewels themselves. Protect them how? Duncan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Charlotte reached into her saddlebags again and withdrew a heavy cloth bundle. When she unwrapped it, Duncan gasped in amazement. Nestled within the fabric were 3 items that gleamed with ancient power: the crown of Scotland, the scepter of the realm, and the sword of state. Mother of God, Duncan whispered. Charlotte, how did you? I have allies in the royal household who remained loyal to my family despite our disgrace, Charlotte explained. When I sent word of the conspiracy through coded letters, they acted quickly. The jewels were removed from Edinburgh Castle 3 days ago and replaced with carefully crafted duplicates. If the conspirators succeed in stealing the crown jewels, they will get worthless replicas while the real symbols of Scottish independence remain safe. Duncan stared at the ancient artifacts, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what Charlotte had accomplished. But where will you hide them? They cannot remain with you, surely. If you are captured, that is where you come in, old friend, Charlotte said. I need you to take them to a place where they will be safe until this conspiracy is defeated. Somewhere the plotters will never think to look, but where loyal Scots can retrieve them when the time is right. Duncan was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of the responsibility Charlotte was asking him to bear. Finally, he spoke. There is a place, he said slowly, an old MacLeod stronghold in the Outer Hebrides. Abandoned for 2 centuries, but still structurally sound. The local fishermen avoid it, believing it to be cursed. My cousin Morag lives on the island, and could be trusted to guard the jewels with her life. Perfect, Charlotte said with relief. But we must move quickly. I believe I may have been followed here today, though I saw no one on the path. As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses echoed from the mouth of the glen. Both Charlotte and Duncan turned to see 2 riders approaching at a casual pace, as if they were merely travelers passing through. But something about their purposeful advance and the way they scanned the surrounding landscape suggested otherwise. Morrison and his partner, Duncan said grimly, recognizing the men from previous encounters. They work for interests that prefer the current balance of power remain unchanged. They are not part of the main conspiracy, but they will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens stability. Charlotte quickly began wrapping the crown jewels back in their protective cloth. Can we escape before they reach us? Duncan studied the approaching riders and the terrain around them. Not both of us, and not with the jewels. But there is another way. He pointed to a narrow cleft in the rocks behind the tomb. That passage leads to a hidden cave system that connects to the next valley. You could escape through there while I delay them. I won't abandon you to face them alone, Charlotte protested. You must, Duncan replied firmly. The mission is more important than either of our lives. Take the jewels and the documents. I will tell them that you were here seeking information about your family's old properties. Nothing more. They may not believe me, but it will give you time to reach safety. Charlotte realized that Duncan was right, but the thought of leaving him to face potential capture, or death, filled her with anguish. This man had served her family faithfully for decades, and now she was asking him to risk everything once again. If you are captured, she said urgently, remember that you know nothing about the documents or the jewels. You are simply helping an old friend visit family graves. I understand, Duncan replied. But Charlotte, there is something else you must know. The conspiracy reaches deeper than even these documents suggest. There are members of the royal family itself who are involved, people who believe that Scotland would be better served as part of a larger European confederation. The riders were now close enough that Charlotte could see their faces clearly. Morrison, the leader, was scanning the area around the tomb with the practiced eye of a professional hunter. His companion had drawn a pistol and was holding it casually but ready for use. Go now, Duncan urged. I will meet you at Morag's cottage on the Isle of Skye in 1 week's time, if I can. If I do not come, assume the worst and proceed without me. Charlotte clasped Duncan's hands one final time, then gathered her precious bundle and the portfolio of documents. She moved swiftly toward the cleft in the rocks, her heart pounding with fear and determination. As she squeezed through the narrow opening, she heard Duncan calling out a greeting to the approaching riders, his voice carefully casual and friendly. The passage beyond the cleft was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for Charlotte to pass through while carrying her burden. She had to feel her way forward carefully, using the rough stone walls as guides. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of conversation, as Duncan engaged the riders in what she hoped would appear to be innocent dialogue. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Charlotte emerged from the cave system into bright daylight on the far side of the mountain. A different valley spread out before her, completely hidden from Glen Moor and the tomb where she had met Duncan. She paused to catch her breath and listened for any sounds of pursuit, but heard nothing except the wind in the heather and the distant cry of a hawk. Charlotte looked back toward the mountain that now separated her from Duncan and felt a pang of guilt at leaving him to face danger alone. But she knew he was right about the importance of the mission. The crown jewels in her possession represented more than mere symbols of monarchy. They were the physical embodiment of Scottish independence and identity. In the wrong hands, they could be used to legitimize foreign rule and the end of Scotland as a free nation. She began the long journey toward the coast where she would need to find passage to the Isle of Skye. The weight of the jewels and documents seemed to increase with every step, but Charlotte forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Somewhere behind her, Duncan was either successfully deceiving Morrison and his partner, or facing interrogation and possible death. Either way, she could not waste the opportunity his sacrifice had provided. As evening approached, Charlotte found herself on a bluff overlooking the sea. In the distance, she could see the misty outline of the Isle of Skye, her destination and the place where she hoped to keep the crown jewels safe until the conspiracy could be defeated. But between her current position and safety lay miles of dangerous terrain, and the possibility that other agents were already searching for her. The oath she had made at the warrior's tomb seemed to echo in her mind as she prepared for the next phase of her desperate mission. The crown would be safe, but at what cost? And could one woman, even with the help of loyal friends like Duncan, hope to defeat a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power across Europe? Only time would tell, but Charlotte MacLeod was determined to honor her family's motto, hold fast. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she would hold fast to her duty, her honor, and her love for Scotland. The ancient stone chambers of Castle Dunscaith echoed with activity as Charlotte and Morag worked to transform the ruined fortress into a center of resistance. For 3 days, they had labored to clear debris from the main hall, secure the entrances, and establish communication lines with the outside world. The crown jewels now rested in a hidden vault beneath the castle's foundations, protected by both steel bars and the superstitious fears that kept curious visitors away. Charlotte stood at one of the castle's arrow slits, watching the sea through the narrow opening as she waited for a signal that would tell her whether her desperate gamble was succeeding. In her hand, she held a coded message that had arrived that morning via carrier pigeon, its contents both encouraging and terrifying in their implications. The message was from her ally Sir Robert Macpherson, who commanded a regiment of Highland soldiers stationed near Stirling. His words were brief but significant. The heather burns bright. Await your signal. It meant that despite the arrests and intimidation campaign launched by the conspirators, key members of Charlotte's network remained loyal and ready to act. But other messages brought darker news. Duncan Fraser had been moved from Edinburgh to a more secure location, suggesting that his interrogation was yielding information the enemy found valuable. 3 more of Charlotte's contacts had disappeared, including a crucial ally within the royal household who had access to the false crown jewels still displayed in Edinburgh Castle. Another bird, Morag called from across the Great Hall, where she was tending to the dozen carrier pigeons that had become their primary means of communication. The bird bore the colors of Clan MacDonald, and Charlotte's heart raced as she unfolded the message tied to its leg. The news from the MacDonald chief was both urgent and welcome. Foreign ships had been spotted off the coast near Mallaig, flying the colors of 3 different nations but clearly coordinating their movements. The invasion force that the conspirators had promised their foreign allies was beginning to assemble, which meant the final phase of their plan was imminent. But MacDonald also reported something unexpected. Similar ships had been seen departing from French ports, but these bore Scottish flags and appeared to be moving to intercept the invasion fleet. Charlotte's network of exiled Scots in France, many of them soldiers and sailors who had fled their homeland rather than serve foreign masters, were returning to defend the country that had cast them out. Morag, Charlotte called urgently, send immediate word to all clan chiefs in our network. The signal fires are to be lit tomorrow at sunset. Operation Highland Dawn begins at first light the following morning. Morag nodded grimly and began preparing the crucial messages that would coordinate the most ambitious act of resistance in Scottish history. Highland Dawn was Charlotte's master plan, a simultaneous uprising designed to expose the conspiracy, rescue key prisoners, and prevent the foreign invasion that would end Scottish independence forever. The plan depended on precise timing and the courage of hundreds of men and women who would risk everything for their homeland. At dawn, loyal soldiers would seize key government buildings in Edinburgh and Glasgow, while Highland clans moved to secure strategic mountain passes that foreign armies would need to advance inland. Simultaneously, rescue parties would attempt to free Duncan Fraser and other captured patriots from their prisons. But the most audacious part of the plan involved Charlotte herself. As dawn broke, she would ride into Edinburgh carrying the authentic crown jewels, challenging the conspirators to explain why there were two sets of Scotland's most sacred artifacts. The dramatic confrontation would force them to reveal their hand prematurely, hopefully before foreign reinforcements could arrive to support them. As evening approached, Charlotte climbed to the highest tower of Castle Dunscath to light the first signal fire. The beacon would be visible from several neighbouring islands, where other loyal Scots would light their own fires in turn. Within hours, a chain of flames would stretch across the Highlands, carrying Charlotte's message to every corner of Scotland. She struck the flint and watched as the carefully prepared kindling caught fire, sending flames and smoke high into the darkening sky. As the beacon blazed to life, Charlotte felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her composure. 12 years of exile, 3 years of dangerous espionage, and weeks of desperate preparation had led to this moment. "For you, Father," she whispered to the wind. "For Duncan, for Hamish, for all who died believing in a free Scotland." The response was swift and dramatic. Within an hour, answering fires began to appear on distant hilltops, each one representing another group of patriots ready to risk everything for their homeland's freedom. By midnight, the entire Highland landscape was dotted with beacons, creating a network of light that connected every clan and community loyal to the cause. But Charlotte knew that their enemies would also see the fires and understand their significance. By morning, government forces would be mobilized to crush the uprising before it could gain momentum. Speed and surprise were essential, which meant Charlotte could not afford to wait for confirmation that all her allies were in position. At dawn, she donned the finest clothes she had brought from France, choosing garments that would mark her as a lady of noble birth, while allowing her freedom of movement. The crown jewels went into specially designed saddlebags that would protect them during the hard ride to Edinburgh, while keeping them easily accessible when the moment came to reveal them. Morag embraced her at the castle gates, tears streaming down the older woman's weathered cheeks. "Bring honour to the MacLeod name, child, and if God wills it, bring Duncan home safely."
"I will," Charlotte promised, though they both knew the odds against her survival were overwhelming. "If I fail, destroy any evidence that might compromise our remaining allies."
"The network must survive, even if I do not." The ride from Skye to Edinburgh normally took 2 days, but Charlotte planned to cover the distance in less than 24 hours by changing horses at safe houses along the route. Her first stop was a farm owned by the MacLeod clan, where fresh mounts and armed escorts waited to accompany her to the mainland. As Charlotte's party thundered across the Scottish countryside, they could see evidence that Highland dawn was already beginning to unfold. Smoke rose from several directions, indicating that government installations were under attack. Groups of armed Highlanders could be seen moving along mountain ridges, positioning themselves to control key routes that foreign armies would need to reach the major cities. But there were also ominous signs that the enemy had not been caught completely off guard. Government cavalry units were moving in coordinated patterns that suggested they had received advance warning of the uprising. Charlotte realized that, despite her precautions, the conspiracy's intelligence network had penetrated her organization more deeply than she had feared. The first real test came at a river crossing near Callander, where a unit of government soldiers had established a checkpoint. Charlotte's escorts, 5 battle-hardened MacLeod warriors led by her cousin Ian, prepared for a fight that could alert enemy forces throughout the region to her presence. "There's another way," Charlotte told them, studying the terrain around the bridge. "We can ford the river upstream and avoid the checkpoint entirely." "The crossing there is treacherous," Ian warned. "We could lose the horses, or worse." "We take that risk," Charlotte decided. "The mission is more important than our individual safety." They guided their mounts upstream to where the river narrowed between rocky banks. The water was deeper and faster than it appeared, and Charlotte's horse struggled against the current as they crossed. For several terrifying moments it seemed they might be swept downstream into the rocks, but superior Highland breeding and training carried them safely to the far shore. The detour cost them precious time, but it also revealed something significant. As they climbed the hills beyond the river, Charlotte could see that the government checkpoint was being reinforced by additional troops arriving from the direction of Stirling. The enemy was clearly moving to intercept her, which meant they knew not only about the uprising, but also about her specific role in it. "They know we're coming," Ian observed grimly. "This could be a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Charlotte replied with a fierce smile. "But sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk into it knowingly and turn it to your own advantage." As they approached the outskirts of Edinburgh, the sounds of battle became increasingly audible. Explosions echoed from the direction of the castle, while columns of smoke rose from several parts of the city. Highland Dawn was unfolding exactly as planned, but the government's response was stronger and more organized than Charlotte had anticipated. Her destination was Holyrood Palace, where she hoped to confront the leaders of the conspiracy in a public forum that would make it difficult for them to simply eliminate her without causing a scandal. But as they crested a hill overlooking the palace, Charlotte saw that enemy forces had anticipated her move. The palace was surrounded by soldiers, while armed men patrolled the surrounding streets in search of threats. Getting close enough to make her dramatic revelation would require either exceptional luck or a willingness to sacrifice everything for one crucial moment of truth. There, Ian pointed to a side entrance that appeared less heavily guarded. "We might be able to reach the palace through the royal gardens." Charlotte studied the proposed route, calculating risks and possibilities. The plan was desperate, but desperation was all they had left. Everything she had worked for over the past 12 years would be decided in the next few hours. "Send word to Sir Robert Macpherson," she instructed one of her escorts. "Tell him to begin the diversionary attack on Edinburgh Castle exactly 1 hour from now." That should draw some of these soldiers away from the palace. As the messenger rode off with his crucial orders, Charlotte began her final preparations. The crown jewels were transferred to a specially designed carry bag that would allow her to reveal them quickly and dramatically. Her weapons were checked and secured, though she knew that if the confrontation came down to violence, her small party would be overwhelmed in minutes. The hour passed slowly as Charlotte and her remaining companions waited in the cover of a wooded park near the palace. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of fighting, intensifying, as other elements of Highland Dawn engaged government forces throughout the city. Everything now depended on whether Charlotte could reach the palace and force the conspirators to reveal themselves before foreign reinforcements arrived to crush the uprising. As the appointed time arrived, explosions erupted from the direction of Edinburgh Castle. Sir Robert Macpherson's attack had begun, and as Charlotte had hoped, many of the soldiers surrounding the palace began moving toward the sounds of battle. The side entrance she had selected was now guarded by only a handful of men. "This is it," Charlotte told her companions. "Whatever happens, remember that we fight not just for ourselves, but for every Scot who dreams of freedom." Ian MacLeod drew his sword and nodded to his men. For Scotland and the MacLeod name, Charlotte spurred her horse toward the palace gates, the crown jewels secure in her saddlebags and her father's memory burning bright in her heart. The final confrontation was at hand, and the fate of Scottish independence hung in the balance. The great hall of Holyrood Palace had never witnessed a more dramatic confrontation than the one that unfolded on that grey October morning in 1745. Charlotte MacLeod stood at the centre of the ancient chamber, still wearing her travel-stained riding clothes, but carrying herself with the dignity of her noble birth. Around her, the most powerful men in Scotland sat in stunned silence as she methodically laid out the evidence of their treachery. On the polished oak table before her lay the documents that had cost her 3 years of dangerous espionage to collect. Letters bearing royal seals, financial records showing payments to foreign agents, and detailed invasion plans that left no doubt about the scope of the conspiracy. But more dramatic still were the crown jewels of Scotland, gleaming in the morning light that streamed through the palace's tall windows. "Gentlemen," Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "I present to you the true crown jewels of Scotland, removed from Edinburgh Castle to prevent their theft by foreign powers. I challenge anyone here to explain why there are identical artifacts currently on display in the royal treasury." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Of the 20 men present, Charlotte could see guilt written clearly on at least half their faces. The others appeared genuinely shocked, suggesting that not all members of the government were part of the conspiracy, just as she had hoped. Lord Mackenzie, the Earl of Ross, was the first to recover his composure. Rising slowly from his chair, he fixed Charlotte with a cold stare that confirmed his involvement in the plot beyond any doubt. "Miss MacLeod," he said with elaborate courtesy, "your father was a traitor who died in exile, and you are clearly following in his footsteps. These wild accusations and theatrical displays cannot disguise the fact that you are nothing more than a desperate exile seeking revenge. Then you will not object to having experts examine both sets of crown jewels?" Charlotte replied sweetly. Surely it would be simple enough to prove which are authentic and which are forgeries. The flash of panic that crossed Mackenzie's face was visible to everyone in the room. He glanced quickly towards several other men, and Charlotte saw them exchange the kind of meaningful looks that confirmed her suspicions about the extent of the conspiracy. But before Mackenzie could respond, the hall's great doors burst open to admit a group of men Charlotte had not expected to see. At their head strode Duncan Fraser, alive and apparently unharmed, despite his supposed capture and interrogation. Behind him came Sir James Stewart, the King's military advisor whose name had appeared on several of the most damning documents. "Duncan," Charlotte exclaimed, relief flooding through her at the sight of her old friend's familiar face. But her joy quickly turned to confusion as she noticed something wrong with the scene. Duncan was not bound or under guard, and Stewart appeared relaxed rather than concerned about the accusations against him. "Miss Charlotte," Duncan said formally, his voice lacking its usual warmth, "I'm afraid I must ask you to surrender the items you have stolen from the royal treasury."
The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow.
The man who had served her family faithfully for decades, who had risked everything to meet her at the warrior's tomb, was now standing with her enemies and demanding that she give up the crown jewels she had sworn to protect. "Duncan, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that your noble gesture has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding," Sir James Stewart replied smoothly. "The conspiracy you believe you uncovered is actually a carefully constructed deception designed to test the loyalty of certain exiled nobles and their potential usefulness to foreign powers." Stewart walked slowly around the table, examining the documents Charlotte had risked everything to obtain. "These papers are genuine, I assure you. But they represent an intelligence operation, not a treasonous plot. We needed to identify which Scottish exiles might be willing to work against their homeland, and your activities in France made you a perfect candidate for our test." Charlotte felt the foundations of her world crumbling beneath her feet. Everything she had believed, every sacrifice she had made, had been based on a lie. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, part of her mind continued to function analytically, searching for flaws in Stewart's explanation. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then why were government forces positioned to intercept me? Why were my allies arrested and imprisoned?" "Security measures," Mackenzie interjected. "Once we realized you had taken the bait and were returning to Scotland with stolen property, we had to protect both you and the crown jewels from genuine foreign agents who might try to intercept them." It was a plausible explanation, but something about it rang false to Charlotte's ears. She looked around the room, studying the faces of the men present, and noticed that several of them appeared as shocked by these revelations as she was. If this had all been a carefully planned intelligence operation, surely more people would have been aware of it.
"You're lying,"
she said suddenly, her voice growing stronger as her analytical mind began to reassert itself. "Some of what you say may be true, but not all of it. Duncan, look at me and tell me honestly that you betrayed our meeting at Glenmore as part of some government operation." Duncan's eyes met hers for a moment, and in them she saw something that confirmed her suspicions. Pain, regret, and most tellingly, fear. This was not a man who had been part of a clever intelligence scheme from the beginning. This was a man who had been broken and turned against his former allies. "What did they threaten you with?" Charlotte asked gently. "Your grandchildren? Your sister's family in Inverness?" The flash of anguish that crossed Duncan's face told her she had guessed correctly. These men had not turned him through money or ideology, but by threatening the innocent people he loved most. The realization filled Charlotte with both fury and understanding. "You see," Stewart said with satisfaction, "even your most trusted ally recognizes the truth of the situation. Now, Miss MacLeod, I must ask you again to surrender the crown jewels, so that this unfortunate episode can be concluded with minimal harm to all parties." Charlotte looked down at the ancient artifacts that had cost her so much to protect, and then back up at the faces surrounding her. Half of these men were clearly part of the conspiracy she had uncovered, while the others appeared to be genuinely loyal Scots who had been deceived by their colleagues. The question was whether she could find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. The sound of cannon fire from the direction of Edinburgh Castle provided her answer. Sir Robert Macpherson's diversionary attack was still in progress, which meant that Highland Dawn was continuing despite her capture. If she could find a way to signal her allies, the uprising might still succeed in exposing the conspiracy. "Before I surrender anything," Charlotte said loudly, "I demand that an independent expert examine both sets of crown jewels to determine which are authentic." "Surely if your explanation is true, you would have no objection to such a test," That won't be necessary, Mackenzie replied quickly. We have our own experts who can. No, Charlotte interrupted. I insist on Professor MacDougall from the University of Edinburgh. He is acknowledged as the foremost authority on Scottish historical artifacts, and his integrity is beyond question. The exchange of glances between the conspirators told Charlotte that her demand had struck home. Professor MacDougall was indeed incorruptible, and his examination would quickly reveal which crown jewels were authentic. More importantly, his involvement would make it impossible for the conspirators to suppress the truth without creating a public scandal. That won't be possible, Stewart said finally. Professor MacDougall is unavailable at the moment.
You mean he's been arrested or killed?
Charlotte replied flatly, because he would have exposed your deception the moment he examined the fake crown jewels in Edinburgh Castle. The admission of guilt was written clearly on Stewart's face, and several of the other men in the room began to look distinctly uncomfortable. Charlotte realized that she might still have a chance to expose the truth, but she would need to act quickly before the conspirators decided to eliminate her rather than risk further revelations.
Gentlemen,
she said, raising her voice so that it carried clearly through the hall.
I call upon those of you who are truly loyal to Scotland to consider what you have heard here today.
These men speak of intelligence operations and security measures, but they cannot explain why an innocent professor has been silenced, why foreign ships gather off our coasts, or why my documents contain detailed plans for the invasion and occupation of our homeland. She reached into her saddlebags and withdrew the most damning document of all, a letter from Prince Eduardo of Castile that outlined the final phases of the conspiracy. This letter, written in the prince's own hand, describes the planned elimination of Scotland's independence and its absorption into a continental empire. Can Mr. Stewart explain why such a document would be necessary for a simple intelligence operation? Stewart's composure finally cracked, and his hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his side. But before he could draw the weapon, one of the previously silent observers stepped forward. Charlotte recognized him as Sir William Campbell, a man whose loyalty to Scotland had never been questioned. "Stop," Campbell commanded, his own sword half drawn. "I've heard enough to know that Miss MacLeod speaks the truth. James, you and your associates will surrender immediately or face the consequences." The hall erupted into chaos as the room divided into two factions. Those loyal to Scotland rallied around Campbell, while the conspirators drew weapons and prepared to fight their way out. In the confusion, Charlotte saw Duncan Fraser break away from Stewart's group and move toward her, his face a mask of shame and determination. "Forgive me, lass," he said as he reached her side. "They threatened my grandchildren, but I should have trusted that you would find a way to protect them." "We can worry about forgiveness later." But even as she spoke, Charlotte realized that the immediate danger was far from over. The sounds of battle from outside the palace were growing closer, suggesting that foreign reinforcements were beginning to arrive. Highland Dawn might have succeeded in exposing the conspiracy, but the invasion that the uprising was meant to prevent was still unfolding. Stewart, now clearly revealed as a traitor, fired his pistol at Campbell and shouted orders to his remaining allies. "Kill the woman and take the jewels. The ships are already landing troops at Leith." Charlotte grabbed the crown jewels and ran for the hall's side entrance, pursued by several armed conspirators. Duncan Fraser and Sir William Campbell fought to cover her escape, their swords flashing in the morning light as they held off superior numbers through skill and determination. As Charlotte burst through the palace doors into the courtyard beyond, she found herself face to face with Ian MacLeod and her other surviving escorts. They had fought their way through the palace guard and were now holding horses ready for a desperate escape. "The harbour!" Charlotte shouted as she mounted her horse. "We have to reach the harbour before the foreign ships land their troops." They rode hard through the streets of Edinburgh, dodging government patrols and foreign advance units that were already beginning to appear in the city. Behind them, the sound of fighting at the palace continued, suggesting that Campbell and Duncan were still holding out against the conspirators. As they approached the harbour, Charlotte could see that the situation was even worse than she had feared. 3 foreign warships were anchored in the Firth of Forth, and boats filled with soldiers were rowing toward the shore. But she could also see something that filled her with hope. Ships flying Scottish colours were sailing into the harbour from the north, their guns already trained on the invasion fleet. The exiled Scots had returned, just as her network had promised. Led by men who had fled their homeland rather than serve foreign masters, they were now fighting to prevent that homeland from being enslaved by those same foreign powers. Charlotte reached the harbour just as the first Scottish ship opened fire on the invasion fleet. The sound of cannon was deafening, and the air filled with smoke and the screams of wounded men. But through the chaos, she could see that the Scottish ships, though outnumbered, were holding their own against the invaders. A familiar figure waved to her from the deck of the lead Scottish ship. It was her brother Hamish, whom she had believed dead these past 5 years. He had survived his supposed death in foreign wars and had spent that time building the fleet of exiled Scots that was now saving their homeland. "Charlotte," Hamish called across the water. "Get the crown jewels aboard. We'll take them to safety." But even as she prepared to transfer the precious artifacts to her brother's ship, Charlotte realized that her mission was not yet complete. The conspiracy had been exposed, and the invasion was being repelled, but the crown jewels still needed to be returned to their rightful place as symbols of Scottish independence. She looked back toward the palace, where smoke was rising from several buildings, and made her decision. The crown jewels belonged not on a ship sailing to exile, but in Scotland itself, held by Scots who would never again allow their homeland to be threatened by foreign conquest. "Hamish," she called back to her brother. "Cover our retreat to the castle. The crown jewels are going home." The final ride to Edinburgh Castle took Charlotte and her escorts through streets filled with the sounds and sights of liberation. Highland Dawn had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, not just in exposing the conspiracy, but in awakening a spirit of Scottish independence that had long been dormant. As she rode through the castle gates carrying the authentic crown jewels, Charlotte MacLeod knew that she had finally honoured the oath she had sworn at the warrior's tomb. The crown was safe, Scotland was free, and the price in blood and sacrifice had been worth paying. The exile had returned, not as a bitter enemy seeking revenge, but as a loyal daughter bringing home the symbols of her nation's independence. The secret oath had been kept, and Scotland would remain free for generations to come.